Racist cop attacks black woman in court, unaware she's his new police chief. Officer Daniels had spent years wielding his badge like a weapon, using it not to protect and serve but to control and intimidate. In a city where corruption thrived in the shadows, he had mastered the art of abuse, particularly against black individuals who had the misfortune of crossing his path. He had arrested countless people under dubious charges, fabricated reports, and used unnecessary force, all while knowing that the system would shield him from consequences. His arrogance had only grown over time, fueled by the unspoken rule that officers like him were untouchable. He relished the fear he instilled, the way people averted their eyes when he walked by, knowing that a single misstep could lead to harassment or worse. He was the kind of cop who saw himself as the ultimate authority, a man whose power couldn't be questioned, especially by those he considered beneath him. That arrogance was on full display in the courtroom that day. Daniels stood tall, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights as he prepared to testify. He had done this dozens of times before, standing in front of a judge, twisting the truth, ensuring his version of events was the only one that mattered. Today, he was confident it would be no different. His latest case involved yet another black defendant, Jamal Brown, a young man he had arrested on vague charges, confident that his word would be enough to convict him. The judge barely looked up as Daniels began speaking, recounting a version of events that painted him as the righteous officer and Jamal as a dangerous criminal. In the back of the room, the doors swung open, but Daniels barely registered it. His focus remained on the judge, on securing yet another easy win. However, something shifted when a woman in a sleek black suit walked in with a quiet, commanding presence. Daniels caught her in his peripheral vision, her sharp eyes locked onto him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. He smirked to himself, assuming she was just another hopeful relative clinging to the foolish idea that the system would grant her loved one justice. He had seen it before. Black families holding on to the false hope that their voices mattered in a courtroom where people like him made the rules. His smirk deepened as he dismissed her and continued his testimony. But then she stood. Daniels felt his irritation spike. Who did she think she was, disrupting his moment? He barked at her to sit down, his voice laced with the same condescension he had used on so many others before. When she didn't immediately comply, he took a step toward her, relishing the moment. This was what he loved most, reminding people of their place, of his authority. He expected her to shrink back, to flinch under his glare. Instead, she held her ground, meeting his eyes without a hint of fear. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice calm but firm. Something about her unwavering stance unsettled him, but he refused to show it. His sneer deepened as he leaned in closer, lowering his voice just enough for her to hear. "You lost," he taunted. "This ain't the welfare office." The hush that fell over the courtroom was immediate, the air thick with tension. The judge's gavel hovered mid-air, shock frozen on his face. A few audible gasps echoed in the room, but Daniels didn't care. He had done this before. He had humiliated plenty of people in this very courtroom, and nothing had ever come of it. The woman, however, didn't react the way he expected. She didn't flinch. She didn't back down. Instead, she reached into her jacket. Daniel's instincts flared. His hand twitched toward his holster, ready to react. He had drawn his gun for less. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath as she pulled out a badge, lifting it high enough for everyone to see. The moment his eyes locked onto it, the world around him seemed to tilt. The badge gleamed under the harsh lights, but not just any badge. His breath hitched, his confidence evaporating in an instant. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice ringing through the silent room with unwavering authority. "Officer Daniels," she said, her words cutting like a blade, "I am Chief Renee Carter, and as of this morning, I am your new boss." Daniels staggered back, his usual smug expression wiped clean from his face. The realization crashed down on him like a tidal wave. He had just assaulted the chief of police. The courtroom erupted in whispers, the air buzzing with disbelief. The judge, finally snapping out of his shock, slammed the gavel down, calling for order, but nothing could erase what had just happened. Daniel's world, the world where he was the one in control, was unraveling right before his eyes. The air in the courtroom had shifted, thick with tension as the weight of Chief Rene Carter's revelation settled over the room like a heavy fog. Officer Daniels stood frozen, his normally smug expression replaced by something rare: fear. His mind scrambled to process what had just happened, but no amount of arrogance or bravado could undo it. He had grabbed, shoved, and humiliated the chief of police, right in front of a judge, an entire courtroom full of witnesses, and most damning of all, the cameras that recorded every second of his downfall. His usual sense of control, the unchecked power he had wielded for years without consequence, was slipping through his fingers, and for the first time in his career, there was no way to twist the narrative in his favor. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, disbelief rippling through the crowd. Daniels' reputation preceded him. Everyone knew how he operated, the way he carried himself, with the entitlement of a man who had never faced real consequences. But now, the balance of power had shifted in a way he had never anticipated. He wasn't the one dictating the terms anymore. He was exposed. The judge, who had previously remained passive in so many of Daniels' cases, now regarded him with something bordering on disdain. The gavel came down sharply. "Order in the court!" His voice was firm, but even he couldn't mask the intrigue simmering beneath his tone. Daniels' breath hitched as he turned his gaze back to Renee, her badge still held high, her presence unwavering. She wasn't just some public official passing through, she was his superior. And not only that, she was the kind of woman he had spent years treating as if she didn't matter, as if her existence was something he could control or dismiss at will. But now, she was the one standing in front of him, holding his career in the palm of her hand. Daniels' fingers twitched at his sides, his instincts screaming at him to regain control, to do something, anything, to flip the situation back in his favor. But there was nothing he could do. Renee didn't just outrank him, she had power, real power, and she had come prepared to use it. The silence in the room was deafening as she spoke again, her voice calm but laced with an unmistakable edge of authority. "Your Honor," she addressed the judge, still not sparing Daniels a glance, as if he were no more than an afterthought, "I request a private discussion regarding Officer Daniels' conduct both today and throughout his career. I believe it will be relevant to these proceedings." Daniels felt the air leave his lungs. No. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was supposed to be testifying, standing in that witness box like he always did, spinning his web of half-truths and outright lies to ensure yet another conviction. But now the focus had turned to him. The judge hesitated, studying her, and in that moment, Daniels felt it. The room itself had shifted. People weren't looking at him as a figure of authority anymore. They weren't buying into his usual air of dominance. Instead, they were watching him like he was the one on trial. His badge, the same one that had always been a shield against scrutiny, suddenly felt like a weight dragging him down. "Very well, Chief Carter," the judge finally said, his voice measured but firm. "We'll take a 15-minute recess." The sound of the gavel striking the desk barely registered in Daniels' ears. This couldn't be happening. This was supposed to be just another routine day in court. Another easy victory where his words would be taken as absolute truth and his actions excused, as they always had been. But instead, he was now the subject of discussion, the one being questioned. The realization clawed at him, cold and relentless. This was the first time in his life that he was truly afraid. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Renee turned, finally meeting his eyes. There was no gloating in her expression, no triumphant smirk. Just calm certainty. Daniels had encountered a lot of people throughout his career, most of whom backed down at the mere suggestion of his authority. But Renee Carter? She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't intimidated by his badge, his uniform, or the power he had once believed was absolute. She was his equal, and more than that, she was his reckoning. He clenched his fists, his mind racing. He needed to fix this. He had connections, he had people who had protected him before. If he could just reach them, make a few calls, spin the situation in his favor, maybe he could turn this around. He reached into his pocket, fingers closing around his phone. But before he could even dial a number, Renee took a step closer, lowering her voice just enough that only he could hear. "You can make all the calls you want, Daniels," she said, her tone steady, unwavering, "but it won't save you this time." His grip on the phone tightened as she walked away, leaving him standing there, drowning in the weight of his own unraveling. Renee Carter had not always worn a badge, nor had she always been in a position of power. Her journey to becoming the first black female police chief in the city's history had been forged through hardship, resilience, and an unshakable commitment to justice. She was born and raised in the very neighborhoods where officers like Daniels thrived, where law enforcement was not seen as protectors but as enforcers of oppression. She had grown up understanding that the system was not designed to serve people like her, that justice was a privilege rarely extended to black families in her city. But she had also grown up with a father who believed in fighting for what was right. A local pastor and community leader, he had spent his life preaching about justice, equality, and the power of standing against corruption. Renee had listened, had believed in his words, but the night her older brother was falsely arrested, dragged from his car, slammed against the hood, and thrown in cuffs for matching a description, something inside her shifted. She had been 16, standing on the sidewalk with her mother, watching helplessly as the reality of being black in America unfolded in front of her eyes. Her brother had done nothing wrong, but that hadn't mattered. What mattered was that the officer, one who carried himself with the same smug authority as Daniels, had decided he was guilty. That was the night Renee made a choice. She would not be a bystander. She would fight the system from within. Becoming an officer had not been easy. The police academy had been a battlefield of its own, a constant struggle against racism disguised as doubt, microaggressions wrapped in concern, and a culture that resented her very presence. She was questioned at every turn. Are you sure you're cut out for this? She was underestimated, dismissed, and even openly challenged by male officers who refused to believe a black woman could command the same authority they did. But every insult, every roadblock, only strengthened her resolve. She climbed the ranks with relentless determination, proving herself not through words but through action. While others looked away from corruption, she confronted it. While officers like Daniels used their badges as shields against accountability, she demanded justice. Every case of excessive force, every fabricated report, every abuse of power, she documented, reported, and fought. Some in the department had called her naive, told her she was wasting her time trying to change a system that had existed long before her and would continue long after she was gone. But Renee didn't care. She refused to let the system swallow her like it had so many before. Her rise to police chief had not come without cost. She had made enemies, powerful ones. Corrupt officers, union leaders, and politicians who thrived in the shadows had tried to stop her at every turn. They had spread rumors, challenged her decisions, even threatened her career. But they underestimated her. She didn't just survive the attacks, she used them as fuel. And now, standing in that courtroom, staring down Officer Daniels, she knew she had finally arrived at the moment she had been preparing for her entire life. This was not just about him. This was about every corrupt cop who had gotten away with abuse, every fabricated charge, every innocent life destroyed by men like him. Daniels didn't know it yet, but she had been watching him long before today. His record was an open wound in the department, complaints buried, lawsuits quietly settled, reports altered to protect him. He was not just another bad cop. He was the embodiment of everything wrong with the system, and she was done watching from the sidelines. As the courtroom emptied for recess, Renee turned toward the judge, already setting the wheels in motion. "Your Honor," she said, pulling a thick folder from her bag and placing it on his desk. "Before we continue Jamal Brown's case, I want you to see something." The judge hesitated but then opened the file. His expression darkened as he flipped through the pages. Complaints, excessive force reports, patterns of abuse that had never been formally investigated. His jaw tightened. "Why haven't I seen this before?" Renee met his eyes without hesitation. "Because Daniels was protected," she said simply, "but not anymore." She could feel Daniels' eyes on her, could sense the panic creeping into his body as the walls around him began to crumble. He had spent years believing he was untouchable, but now, for the first time, he was afraid. He knew what she was capable of, and more importantly, he knew she wasn't going to stop. As the judge placed the folder down, he exhaled slowly, as if absorbing the weight of what he had just seen. "We will discuss this further after recess," he said, his tone different now, more serious, more aware. Renee nodded, stepping back, but she wasn't finished. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. An officer stepped in, his face uneasy. "Chief Carter, you might want to see this." Renee followed him into the hallway where a small crowd had gathered outside the courthouse. Reporters, cameras, microphones, all aimed at the center of attention, Daniels. He stood flanked by a lawyer and a few high-ranking officers, speaking into a microphone with the confidence of a man who still believed he could control the story. "This is a political hit job," he declared, shaking his head as if the weight of injustice had fallen upon him. "I have done nothing wrong. I am being targeted because I uphold the law." Renee clenched her jaw, watching the scene unfold. This was his game. He knew he couldn't beat her in court, so he was trying to win in the public eye. She had seen it before. Corrupt men spinning the truth, painting themselves as victims while hiding behind their badges. But this time, it wouldn't work. She had evidence, witnesses, and the will to fight back. As Daniels continued his speech, rallying support from those desperate to believe in the myth of the righteous officer under attack, Renee simply watched, her expression unreadable. Let him talk. Let him lie. Because in the end, the truth was coming, and when it did, no amount of press conferences would save him. Daniels stormed out of the courthouse, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight as he ignored the stares and murmurs around him. His world was unraveling, and he could feel it slipping through his fingers. For years he had walked through this city untouchable, shielded by a system that protected men like him, by colleagues who looked the other way, and by superiors who covered for him because he got results. But now, Chief Renee Carter had thrown a wrench into everything, exposing his past, challenging his authority, and worst of all, threatening his entire career. He could already hear the whispers, see the shift in how people looked at him. There was doubt now, hesitation. His own department was starting to treat him like a liability instead of an asset. He refused to let that happen. He had spent years cultivating his power, manipulating the system, ensuring that no matter how many complaints were filed, no matter how many times someone accused him of excessive force, it all disappeared into a black hole of bureaucracy. He wasn't about to let one woman, no matter how powerful she thought she was, destroy everything he had built. His mind raced as he pulled out his phone, dialing a familiar number. "Yeah, it's me," he muttered as soon as the line picked up. "We have a problem." He moved quickly, stepping into the shadowed corner of the courthouse, keeping his voice low. He had connections, people who owed him favors, people who wouldn't want this investigation digging too deep. If Carter thought she was going to bury him, she was dead wrong. He needed leverage, something, anything to discredit her, to make her look corrupt, incompetent, unfit for her position. If he could spin this the right way, if he could turn this into a political spectacle, he could shift the narrative before it was too late. The voice on the other end of the line hesitated before answering. "Daniels, this isn't just some political stunt. Carter has evidence, real evidence," Daniels sneered, tightening his grip on the phone. "Then we make sure no one sees it." That night, under the cover of darkness, a masked figure broke into the police department's internal evidence room. Files were pulled, computers wiped, records linking Daniels to past abuses vanished in minutes. By morning, the case against him was thinner, weaker. But he wasn't done. As Renee arrived at the station the next day, she found her office ransacked, papers scattered, desk drawers thrown open, a single sheet of paper left behind as a warning. Back off. She picked it up, reading the words slowly, then smiled. Daniels had just made a fatal mistake. He thought intimidation would stop her, that she would back down the way so many had before. He didn't realize that she had spent her entire career fighting people like him. She turned to her assistant. "Get me a warrant. I know exactly where to look." Meanwhile, Daniels was already working on the next phase of his plan. He held a press conference, standing in front of a row of uniformed officers who had once supported him without question. His voice was firm, controlled, the same tone he had used for years to manipulate juries, judges, and the media. "This is a political hit job," he declared, shaking his head as if the weight of injustice had fallen upon him. "I have spent my entire career protecting this city, putting criminals behind bars, and now, because of political games, my career is being destroyed." He paused for effect, glancing at the cameras, ensuring they captured his carefully crafted image of the righteous officer under attack. He knew how this worked. People wanted a hero, and if he played his cards right, he could turn himself into one. The headlines the next morning were exactly what he needed. Decorated officer under fire. Is Chief Carter targeting honest cops? He smirked as he scrolled through the articles, but deep down, he knew it wasn't enough. Carter wasn't backing down, and if she had even half of what she claimed, he was still in danger. He needed something bigger, something that would force her onto the defensive. He picked up his phone again, calling in another favor. "Find me something on her," he ordered. "Anything. I don't care if it's a decades-old parking ticket. I need leverage." But the voice on the other end was less certain this time. "Daniels, listen. This isn't like before. Carter is different. She's not just some politician looking for headlines. She's coming after you with everything she has." Daniels' jaw tightened. "Then we make sure she doesn't have anything left." He hung up, his mind racing. That night, Renee's team executed the warrant. They raided an off-duty storage unit linked to Daniels, a small, unassuming space at a rundown facility on the outskirts of town. Inside, they found boxes of files, old case documents, and something even more damning. A stack of VHS tapes and USB drives labeled with names. Each one represented a victim of Officer Daniels. Renee's breath caught in her throat as she picked up one labeled Marcus Avery, 2012. She knew that name. Everyone in the city knew that name. Marcus had been a black teenager killed during a routine traffic stop, with Daniels claiming he had reached for a weapon. There had been no body cam footage, no video evidence, until now. She plugged the USB into her laptop, her team huddled around her as the screen flickered to life. The footage played, and the truth was worse than she had imagined. Daniels had planted the gun. The video showed him casually dropping a weapon next to Marcus's lifeless hand, calling it in as if it were routine. No hesitation, no remorse. Just another cover-up in a long list of them. The room went silent. One of the officers, a young recruit, swallowed hard. Jesus Christ. Renee exhaled slowly. She had known Daniels was corrupt, but this was murder, and now she had the proof to bring him down. Meanwhile, Daniels sat in a dimly lit bar, swirling whiskey in his glass, his phone buzzing non-stop. The voice on the other end was frantic. "We have a problem. They found the tapes. They found everything." The glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the floor. No. No. That's impossible. His mind raced, his pulse hammering. His entire career, his entire world was about to come crashing down. Renee Carter stood in the dimly lit evidence room, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk as she stared at the files laid out before her. This was it. The proof she had been searching for, the final nail in the coffin for Officer Daniels. For years, he had hidden behind his badge, using the system to cover his tracks, but now the system had turned against him. The box in front of her contained decades of misconduct, complaints that had been dismissed without investigation, excessive force reports that had mysteriously disappeared, and most damning of all, the tapes. Dozens of them, each labeled with a name and a date, each representing a life Daniels had destroyed, a victim whose cries for justice had been silenced. Renee exhaled, her jaw tightening as she picked up a USB drive labeled Marcus Avery, 2012. She had known the case well, a routine traffic stop that had ended in the death of a black teenager, a gun found at the scene, a report written and signed by Daniels himself, claiming the suspect had been reaching for a weapon. No body cam footage had ever surfaced, no questions had been asked, and Daniels had walked away without consequence. But now, finally, the truth was in her hands. She plugged the USB into her laptop, the screen flickering to life as her team gathered around her. The footage played in silence, the grainy body cam recording showing Daniels approaching the car, barking orders at the driver. "Marcus!" The kid looked terrified, his hands gripping the wheel, his voice shaking as he complied. Daniels pulled him out roughly, pushing him against the hood, patting him. Then, just as quickly, the scene shifted. Marcus had done nothing, but Daniels shoved him to the ground, drew his gun, and fired. The boy crumpled instantly. The room went still. Renee's breath caught in her throat, her hands curling into fists as the next part of the footage played. Daniels stood over Marcus's motionless body, glancing around as if ensuring no one else was watching. Then, from his belt, he pulled out a gun. His own. With a practiced ease, he bent down and placed it next to Marcus's outstretched hand. He stepped back, grabbed his radio and spoke in an eerily calm voice. "Suspect reached for a weapon. Shots fired. Requesting medical." He had staged the entire thing. The weapon was planted. The murder was deliberate. And for 10 years, he had gotten away with it. A sickening silence settled over the evidence room as the video ended. One of the officers standing behind René muttered, "Jesus Christ." Another ran a hand down his face, looking pale. They had all known Daniels was corrupt, but this was murder, and if he had done it once, how many others had suffered the same fate? René swallowed the rage rising in her chest. This was why she had fought so hard, why she had spent years climbing the ranks, pushing through every barrier placed in her way. Because the system had never been broken, it had been designed this way. And now, she had the power to dismantle it, to expose every lie, every cover-up, every officer who had turned a blind eye to what was happening right under their noses. She turned sharply to one of her officers. "Get this footage to the DA. I want Daniels arrested before the night is over." The officer hesitated. You know he still has people in high places, right? He's not going to go down without a fight." René clenched her jaw. "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance." Outside, the city was already buzzing. News of the investigation had leaked, and reporters were swarming the courthouse, demanding answers. Daniels, ever the manipulator, had tried to control the story, painting himself as a victim, claiming he was being targeted for doing his job. But as soon as the footage went public, everything changed. The public outcry was immediate. Protests erupted. People took to the streets demanding justice for Marcus Avery and every other victim who had been swept under the rug. The department was in chaos, officers scrambling to distance themselves from Daniels. But it was too late. The truth was out. Daniels himself had gone into hiding. For the first time in his life, he was afraid. He had spent years walking into this courthouse with his head high, knowing the system would protect him, but now that same system had turned its back on him. His colleagues, the ones who had once laughed at his racist jokes and backed up his false reports, were scrambling to cut ties. No one wanted to be caught in the blast when Daniels finally fell. And he knew it was coming. There was no fixing this, no covering it up, no twisting the narrative in his favor. This time, there was proof. But Daniels wasn't going down without a fight. Desperation had turned into recklessness, and when men like him felt cornered, they became dangerous. René knew that. She had dealt with men like him her entire life. That was why she was already 3 steps ahead. She had ordered his home, his storage units, his personal accounts to be searched. Every trace of his corruption would be unearthed and exposed for the world to see. This wasn't just about bringing down one dirty cop. This was about dismantling the system that had allowed him to thrive. As night fell, officers were deployed to track him down. René stood at the precinct, watching as the operation unfolded. Daniels had spent his entire life believing he was above the law, that he would never be held accountable. But now, his time had run out. And as she looked out at the city, at the people demanding justice, at the officers who were finally being forced to confront their complicity, she knew one thing for certain. Daniels was just the beginning. Daniels sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his mind racing through every possible escape route. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. He had spent years making sure he was untouchable, ensuring that every complaint against him disappeared, that every questionable incident was buried before it could ever see the light of day. But now, everything was unraveling. René Carter had done what no one else had. She had found the proof. And worse, she had gone public with it. The video of Marcus Avery's murder had already begun spreading like wildfire, playing on every news channel, flooding social media, turning him into the face of corruption overnight. It wasn't just one bad arrest, not just excessive force. It was murder, and the entire world had just watched him commit it. The walls were closing in, and for the first time in his career, he had no control over the narrative. His phone vibrated on the dashboard, messages pouring in one after another. Some were from old colleagues telling him to lay low, to disappear before things got worse. Others were from reporters demanding a statement. But the worst ones were from men who had once protected him, officers and officials who were now cutting ties, acting as if they had never known him. He clenched his jaw, scrolling through the messages, his heart pounding. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had been loyal to the department, had done things that others didn't have the guts to do, had made sure the city stayed in check, and now they were abandoning him. He had always known that the system protected its own, that it bent the rules to keep men like him safe, but now that he was a liability, the same system that had shielded him for years was turning its back on him. He slammed his fist against the dashboard, his breath ragged. A call came through and he hesitated before answering. It was his lawyer. "Daniels, we need to talk." His voice was controlled, professional, but Daniels could hear the tension underneath. "The department is moving to suspend you indefinitely without pay." Daniels' stomach twisted. "They can't do that." His voice was sharp, laced with the remnants of his authority, but for the first time it sounded hollow. The lawyer exhaled. "They can, and they will. Carter's press conference changed everything. The union is already backing away, and the DA—" He hesitated. "They're building a case. You need to prepare for the possibility of an indictment." Daniels' pulse thundered in his ears. Indictment. The word tasted foreign, impossible. He wasn't the one who got indicted. He was the one who made arrests, who put criminals behind bars. This was a nightmare, one he couldn't wake up from. He gritted his teeth. "What about the footage? Can we challenge it, say it was edited?" The lawyer's silence was deafening. "It's airtight, Daniels. There's no way out of this." Daniels ended the call without another word, his mind spiraling into desperation. He needed to think. He needed a way out. He had one last chance, and he knew exactly what it was. If the system was turning against him, then he had to destroy the evidence before they could use it. He grabbed his phone, dialing another number. "I need you to do something for me." His voice was lower now, edged with urgency. The voice on the other end hesitated. "Daniels, this is bad. Carter has everything. You need to start thinking about cutting a deal." Daniels cut him off. "No, I don't need a deal. I need you to wipe every last trace of that footage. I don't care how you do it." Another pause. Then, finally, "It's too late." Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean, it's too late?" The voice sighed. "The footage has already been duplicated across multiple servers. The DA has copies, the media has copies. Even if you burned every physical tape, the video is everywhere. You can't erase it." Daniel's chest tightened. This was real. There was no way out. The panic that had been simmering beneath the surface finally surged to the forefront, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to be the one in control, the one pulling the strings, the one who walked away from every mess untouched. Not like this. Never like this. And then, the final blow. His lawyer called again. "Daniels, listen carefully. The DA is filing charges against you. You're being formally charged with second-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of evidence tampering. There's already a warrant out for your arrest." The word struck like a hammer, reverberating through his skull. Arrest. Indictment. Murder. He gritted his teeth, shaking his head. No. No, he would not let them drag him through this. He wouldn't sit in a cold interrogation room while they tore his life apart. He wouldn't be paraded in front of the cameras in handcuffs, the same way he had done to so many others. He would not lose like this. The streets blurred past him as he slammed his foot on the gas, speeding toward the only place he could think of. His last stronghold, the police union office. They wouldn't abandon him. They couldn't. He had done too much for them. If they let him fall, who would be next? He burst through the doors, demanding a meeting. "You can't just throw me to the wolves," he spat. "I did what had to be done. The streets are safer because of me." But the men inside, the same ones who had laughed at his jokes, who had protected him for years, shifted uncomfortably. One of them, an older officer, cleared his throat. "Daniels, you need to get out in front of this. Deny it. Say the footage was doctored." Daniels scoffed. "You think that'll hold up? Carter has the public eating out of her hand." Another officer, one who had been his ally for years, shook his head. "No, Daniels, you don't get it. You're next. We're not risking our careers for you." Daniels' blood ran cold. They were abandoning him. The same system that had protected him for years was now washing its hands of him. He was no longer a brother in blue. He was a liability. For the first time in his life, he felt powerless. He turned without another word, stepping back onto the street, the weight of his downfall pressing down on him. He had nowhere left to go. He had always thought that no matter what happened, he would never end up like the men he arrested. But now, with the entire city watching, with his enemies closing in, he realized the truth. He was just another criminal on the run. Daniels gripped the steering wheel, his pulse hammering in his ears as the city lights blurred past him. He had no plan, no backup, no protection, only the sinking realization that he was alone. For years he had walked these streets with the certainty that he would never answer for his actions, that his badge was a shield, his power unquestioned. But now, everything had changed. He had gone from the hunter to the hunted. A fugitive with his face plastered across every news station, his crimes exposed, his name dragged through the mud. And worst of all, Renee Carter was closing in. He knew she wouldn't stop. Not until he was in handcuffs, his career obliterated, his reputation destroyed. He had only one choice left. He had to run. But even as he pressed harder on the gas, weaving through traffic, a deeper truth gnawed at him. There was nowhere left to go. Renee stood outside an abandoned warehouse near the docks, the cool night air heavy with anticipation. This was where it would end. She had anticipated Daniel's every move, knew he was too arrogant to disappear quietly. He had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable, and men like him didn't go down without a fight. She adjusted her grip on her weapon, her eyes scanning the darkened entrance. He was inside. The moment he had fled from his failed attempt to rally support at the police union, he had sealed his fate. There was no way out of this, and deep down he knew it. Her phone buzzed. A text from one of her officers. Perimeter secured, no sign of movement. She exhaled slowly, stepping forward. Time to finish this. Inside, Daniels crouched behind a stack of crates, his breath shallow, his stolen service weapon gripped tightly in his hands. His mind raced through 1,000 different outcomes, but none of them ended in his favor. He was trapped. He could hear the faint rustling outside, the quiet footsteps. They had found him. He swallowed hard, sweat slicking his palms. He had spent his entire life preying on fear, using intimidation as his weapon. But now, in the dimly lit warehouse, with the law closing in on him, he finally understood what it felt like to be afraid. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was the prey. The metal door creaked open, and Renee stepped inside, her silhouette sharp against the flickering light. "Daniels!" she called out, her voice steady. "It's over." A bitter laugh escaped his lips. "You think you've won?" His voice was raw, edged with desperation. "You think bringing me down changes anything? The system made me, Carter. And when I'm gone, someone just like me will take my place." Renee didn't flinch. She had heard this before. The justification, the deflection, the refusal to take responsibility. "No, Daniels, the system let you exist, but change starts today." The tension in the air was suffocating. Daniels' grip tightened around his weapon. He had one last chance. He lunged from behind the crates, his gun raised. A final, desperate act of defiance. A single gunshot echoed through the warehouse. Daniels staggered back, his weapon slipping from his fingers as he collapsed against the crates, his shoulder soaked in red. His breathing was ragged, his strength draining by the second. Renee's gun remained steady, her gaze unwavering. "I told you it was over." The warehouse doors burst open, officers flooding inside, their weapons drawn. Daniels barely registered the hands gripping his arms, the cold metal of the cuffs locking around his wrists. For the first time in his life, he had no power, no control. As he was dragged to his feet, Renee stepped forward, meeting his eyes one last time. There was no gloating, no satisfaction, just justice. He had terrorized this city for years. Now, he would finally answer for it. The courtroom was packed, a sea of tense faces and cameras capturing every moment as Officer Daniels stood in the center, his once pristine uniform replaced with an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him. The man who had spent years wielding his badge like a weapon, who had walked into this very courtroom countless times with smug arrogance, now stood as a defendant, powerless and exposed. The prosecution laid out the case with brutal efficiency. The body cam footage, the falsified reports, the testimonies of those he had brutalized, the murder of Marcus Avery. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable, damning. Renee Carter sat in the front row, her hands clasped together, her face unreadable as she listened to the truth, finally, being spoken aloud. No longer buried, no longer silenced. Every lie Daniels had told, every life he had destroyed, every abuse of power he had committed, it was all laid bare before the world. And for the first time in his life, he had no escape. The jury deliberated for hours, but the outcome was inevitable. When they returned, the room fell into a tense silence, the weight of history pressing down on every person present. The foreman stood, clearing his throat before delivering the words that would seal Daniel's fate. Guilty. The room erupted. Not in celebration, but in a collective exhale, a release of years of fear, of injustice, of suffering. A mother wept in the back, clutching a framed photo of her son, one of Daniel's victims. The judge's voice was firm, final. Officer Daniels, this court finds you guilty of second-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and multiple counts of evidence tampering. You are hereby sentenced to 25 years without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck, a sound that, for once, did not signify the silencing of truth, but rather the beginning of accountability. Daniels did not speak as the bailiffs moved to escort him out, his face drained of all its former confidence. He glanced at Renee as he passed, his expression unreadable, but she did not look away. He had spent years making people feel small, making them feel powerless, but today he was the one who had to face a system that would no longer protect him. He was no longer Officer Daniels. He was a criminal, and justice, long overdue, had finally caught up with him. But for Renee, this was only the beginning. Daniel's fall had shaken the city to its core, forcing people to confront the corruption they had long ignored. His conviction was not just about him. It was about every officer who had abused their power and walked away unscathed. Every department that had covered up wrongdoing, every victim who had been denied justice. In the days following the verdict, the police department was thrown into upheaval. More officers resigned, internal investigations intensified, and the media turned its focus to uncovering the depth of corruption that had allowed Daniels to thrive for so long. The public, once skeptical, now demanded real reform. For the first time in years, people believed that change was possible. New policies were drafted, stricter oversight, mandatory body cameras, an independent review board to investigate police misconduct. Officers who had once operated with impunity now knew that they could be held accountable. The old guard, the ones who had protected men like Daniels, fought back, claiming the department was under attack, that this was a war against law enforcement. But Renee did not waver. This was not about attacking officers. This was about protecting the people they had sworn to serve, and if that meant dismantling a broken system piece by piece, then so be it. Outside the courthouse, a group of young activists stood holding signs. Justice for Marcus Avery. Justice for the victims. No more corruption. Renee walked past them, pausing briefly as one of them met her gaze. A young girl, no older than 16, her eyes fierce with determination. Renee saw herself in her, saw the fire of someone who had witnessed injustice and refused to accept it as the way things had to be. The girl didn't speak, but she didn't have to. This fight was bigger than any one person. It had always been. As Renee stepped into her car, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. One down, many more to go. She exhaled slowly, gripping the steering wheel. Daniels was gone. But the fight was far from over. The sun was beginning to set over the city as Renee Carter stood outside the precinct, watching as the weight of the past few weeks finally began to settle. The case against Daniels had reached its conclusion, and for the first time in years, the people who had suffered under his abuse could finally breathe. His conviction had sent a shockwave through the department, shaking its very foundation, forcing conversations that had been avoided for too long. But as she looked around, she knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Corruption didn't die with the downfall of one man, and the system that had protected Daniels for so long was still in place, still waiting for the next officer willing to exploit it. But today, something was different. People were watching now. The community had seen what accountability looked like, and they would never accept silence again. As Renee walked toward her car, she noticed a familiar figure waiting for her near the entrance. Jamal Brown, the young man who had been falsely arrested by Daniels, stood with his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. He had been through hell, dragged through a justice system that had never been built for people like him, treated as guilty before he had even spoken a word in his own defense. And yet, here he was, standing tall, watching the woman who had fought for him. Renee approached, offering him a small nod. "It's over," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they weren't entirely true. Jamal smirked slightly, shaking his head. "For him, maybe, but what about the next one?" His voice wasn't bitter, just honest, and Renee knew he was right. Daniels was gone, but what about the officers who had covered for him, the ones who had looked the other way, the ones who had sat silently while men like Jamal were falsely accused, falsely convicted, left to rot in a system that was built to break them? She exhaled slowly, crossing her arms. "Then, we make sure there isn't a next one." Jamal studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I want to help." The words caught her off guard, but she saw the determination in his eyes, the same fire she had felt all those years ago when she first stepped into the academy, determined to change a system that was designed to keep people like her out. She knew what this meant for him, the difference between moving on and choosing to fight. And she also knew what it meant for her. This wasn't just about Daniels. It had never been just about him. It was about something bigger, about every young black man who had ever been told his life didn't matter, about every mother who had been forced to bury a son because justice was something only granted to a select few. It was about breaking the cycle before it could ever repeat itself. As she looked at Jamal, she saw not just a survivor but a fighter, someone who refused to let his past define him. And in that moment, Renee made a decision. This wasn't just her battle anymore. Change couldn't happen in a courtroom alone, couldn't be dictated by policies written on paper. It had to come from the streets, from the people who had suffered the most, from those who had seen firsthand what injustice looked like and refused to let it continue. She reached into her pocket, pulling out her card and handing it to him. "Then let's get to work." Jamal took it without hesitation, slipping it into his pocket. The fight wasn't over. The city was changing, and for the first time in a long time, the people had hope. This was a new beginning. The story of Officer Daniels' downfall and Renee Carter's fight for justice carries deep lessons that extend far beyond the courtroom. It reminds us that silence in the face of wrongdoing is complicity. For years, Daniels operated with impunity, not just because of his own actions, but because others allowed him to. Too often, people turn away from injustice, convincing themselves that it is not their problem, or that speaking up will make no difference. But history teaches us that change only happens when individuals refuse to accept corruption as the norm. Renee Carter's journey illustrates the power of perseverance, of refusing to be intimidated by a system designed to suppress the truth. Her story shows us that one person's courage can set off a ripple effect, inspiring others to demand accountability. This is a lesson particularly relevant for older generations, who have witnessed cycles of injustice and reform throughout history. Many have seen firsthand how institutions resist change, and how progress is only achieved through consistent effort and the willingness to stand firm in one's convictions. Beyond the fight for justice, this story also highlights the importance of legacy. As we age, we must ask ourselves what kind of world we are leaving behind for future generations. Will we allow injustice to persist, or will we take the lessons of our past and use them to guide the next wave of changemakers? Renee's decision to mentor young voices like Jamal Brown reflects the understanding that knowledge, experience, and moral conviction must be passed down. True change is not just about punishing the guilty. It is about building a system that prevents abuse from happening again. This is a lesson that resonates deeply, especially for those who have spent a lifetime witnessing both the best and worst of human nature. In the end, this story teaches us that while corruption may seem deeply rooted, it is never unbreakable. Justice, once awakened, is unstoppable. Justice, once awakened, is unstoppable.